The Roberts family had lived in Millfield, Ohio for 4 generations by the time Eleanor Roberts inherited the sprawling Victorian home in the summer of 1942. The small coal mining town, nestled in the rolling hills of Athens County, had seen better days. Most of the young men were overseas fighting in the war, leaving behind a quiet community of women, children, and older men who couldn't serve. Eleanor, a stern woman of 35 with prematurely graying hair and sharp blue eyes, had never married. She taught mathematics at the local high school and kept to herself, rarely engaging with neighbors beyond polite nods. When her father, Henry Roberts, passed away from pneumonia that April, no one in town was surprised that the family home went to her rather than to her younger brother James, who had moved to Cincinnati years ago. "You should sell it," James had suggested during his brief visit for their father's funeral. He stood in the parlor, fidgeting with his hat, clearly uncomfortable being back in the house. "This place is too big for one person, and the upkeep will drain your savings." Eleanor had simply fixed him with a cold stare. "This house has been in our family since grandfather built it in 1876. I'm not selling it." "Then I'll help you pack up father's things," James offered half-heartedly, knowing full well his sister would refuse. "No need," Eleanor replied. "I'll take care of it. You should get back to your family." James had left that same afternoon, visibly relieved to escape. Eleanor didn't blame him. She knew he felt the same unease in the house that she did, the sensation of being watched, the inexplicable cold spots, the shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. But unlike James, who had run from it, Eleanor had made her peace with the house's peculiarities long ago, or so she thought. It was while sorting through her father's desk that Eleanor found the old family albums. Henry Roberts had been meticulous about documentation, and there were photographs dating back to the 1880s. Eleanor spent an evening arranging them chronologically on the dining room table, pouring herself a glass of sherry as she flipped through images of stern-faced relatives posed in their Sunday best. The family resemblance was strong, the same sharp jawline, the same pale eyes. She recognized her grandfather, Edwin Roberts, standing proudly in front of the newly constructed house. There was her grandmother, Mary, holding Eleanor's infant father. There were aunts and uncles she had never met, cousins who had moved away decades ago. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor noticed something odd. In a photograph from 1896, a Roberts family reunion on the front lawn, there was a shadow behind her grandfather that didn't seem to belong to anyone in the picture. It was distinctly human-shaped, but none of the 18 people in the photograph could have cast it given the angle of the sun. "A photographic anomaly," Eleanor murmured to herself, dismissing it. But then she saw it again in a 1903 Christmas gathering photograph. The same human-shaped shadow, this time lurking in the corner of the parlor, and again in a 1911 wedding photo and a 1923 funeral. Always the same shape, always lurking just at the edge of the frame, never belonging to any visible person. With growing unease, Eleanor began to examine every family photograph. The shadow was present in nearly all of them, growing more distinct over the years. In the most recent photos, from her father's 65th birthday celebration the previous year, the shadow stood directly behind Henry Roberts, its form so clear that Eleanor could make out the shape of shoulders, a head, even what appeared to be the outline of a face. Yet there was never a body casting it. Eleanor's hands trembled as she closed the album. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, a recurring flaw in the family camera perhaps, or a trick of light in the house. But deep down, she knew better. The shadow had appeared in photographs taken by different cameras, in different locations, over the span of nearly 50 years. She poured herself another glass of sherry and carried it upstairs to her bedroom, her childhood bedroom, which she had reclaimed after her father's death rather than move into the master suite. As she passed her father's closed door, she heard a faint sound from within. a creak, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden floorboards. Eleanor froze, the hair on her arms rising. For a moment, she considered investigating, but something stopped her. Instead, she hurried to her room and locked the door behind her. That night, she dreamed of shadows, peeling themselves from the walls, drifting across the ceiling like smoke, coalescing into human forms that watched her with hollow eyes. The next morning, Eleanor called the local photography studio. "I need to speak with someone about photographic anomalies," she explained to the young woman who answered. "Specifically, shadows appearing in photographs where they shouldn't be." "You'll want to speak with Mr. Finch," the receptionist said. "He's been taking photographs in this county for 40 years. If anyone would know about such things, it's him." Mr. Finch was a wiry old man with thick glasses and liver spots on his hands. He invited Eleanor into his studio and examined the photographs she brought with obvious interest. "Most unusual," he muttered, holding one up to the light. "I've seen double exposures, light leaks, all manner of photographic oddities in my time, but this—" he shook his head. "This shadow appears consistently over decades, across different photographic media, and it's always connected to your family." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Always in family photographs, never in pictures of just one person or of non-family members." Mr. Finch rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Miss Roberts, I don't mean to pry, but has your family experienced any unusual deaths? Tragic accidents, perhaps, or unexplained disappearances?" Eleanor stiffened. "Why do you ask?" "In my younger days, I had an interest in the paranormal," Mr. Finch admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "I've read accounts of shadow phenomena associated with violent or untimely deaths. Some believe these shadows are spirits caught between worlds, unable to move on due to unfinished business." Eleanor thought of her mother, who had died in childbirth when James was born, of her Uncle William, who had fallen down the stairs and broken his neck when Eleanor was just a child, of her cousin Peter, who had gone swimming in the creek one summer day and never returned. "There have been deaths," she acknowledged cautiously, "but nothing out of the ordinary for a large family over several generations." Mr. Finch nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Perhaps you should speak with Mrs. Holloway. She lives on Maple Street, the blue house with the white trim. She knows about such things." Eleanor thanked him and left, the photographs tucked safely in her purse. She had no intention of visiting Mrs. Holloway, whom she knew by reputation as an eccentric widow who claimed to communicate with the dead. Such nonsense had no place in Eleanor's rational, mathematical mind. Yet that evening, as shadows lengthened across the yard, Eleanor found herself walking down Maple Street, her steps slowing as she approached the blue house with white trim. Mrs. Holloway was nothing like Eleanor had expected. Rather than a wild-eyed mystic draped in scarves, she was a petite, neatly dressed woman in her 60s, with silver hair arranged in a practical bun. Her home was equally ordinary, clean, modestly furnished, with framed needlepoint hanging on the walls. "Mr. Finch telephoned to say you might visit," Mrs. Holloway said, gesturing for Eleanor to sit. "He mentioned photographs with an unusual shadow." Eleanor hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. "I'm not sure why I came. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits." "Belief is irrelevant to truth, Miss Roberts," Mrs. Holloway replied calmly. "May I see the photographs?" With reluctance, Eleanor handed them over. Mrs. Holloway examined each one carefully, her expression growing increasingly grave. "This is not a ghost in the traditional sense," she finally said. "This is something older, something that has attached itself to your family line." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, a chill running down her spine despite her skepticism. "In the old country, they called them followers. Entities that latch onto a family bloodline, usually because of some ancient wrong or debt." Mrs. Holloway pointed to the earliest photograph. "It starts faintly here, barely perceptible, but it grows stronger over time, feeding on your family's energy, perhaps on your deaths." "That's absurd," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Tell me, Miss Roberts, have members of your family suffered from unexplained illnesses? Depression, perhaps, or a feeling of being drained of vitality?" Eleanor thought of her father's rapid decline over the past year, how he had aged 20 years in 12 months, of her own chronic fatigue, the headaches that plagued her, the difficulty she had sleeping in that house. What would cause such a thing to attach to a family? She asked, carefully avoiding answering Mrs. Holloway's question directly. "Usually a grave misdeed," Mrs. Holloway replied, "a terrible crime covered up, a wrong never righted. Do you know how your grandfather acquired the land for your home?" Eleanor frowned. "He purchased it fairly, as I understand." "Did he?" Mrs. Holloway's gaze was penetrating. "This area was not always as it is now. Before the mines, before the settlers, there were others here, and the land remembers what was done to them." Eleanor stood abruptly. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Holloway, but I should be going." Mrs. Holloway rose as well. "Be careful, Miss Roberts. The shadow in your photographs is growing stronger. In the most recent images, it's almost fully formed. When it completes its manifestation—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "What happens then?" Eleanor couldn't help asking. "Then it takes what it came for," Mrs. Holloway said simply. Eleanor left, unsettled but still unwilling to give credence to the woman's superstitious warnings. Yet as she walked home through the gathering dusk, she found herself hurrying, casting nervous glances at her own shadow stretching before her on the sidewalk. That night, Eleanor dreamed again of shadows, but this time they didn't just watch. They reached for her with elongated fingers, their touch like ice against her skin. She woke gasping, heart pounding, to find her bedroom significantly colder than it should have been on a summer night, and on the wall opposite her bed, cast by no discernible light source, was a human-shaped shadow. Eleanor spent the next morning at the county records office, searching through property deeds and land surveys. If Mrs. Holloway's implications about the Roberts family land had any basis, in fact, there would be documentation. The clerk, a balding man named Morris, who had been a senior when Eleanor was a freshman in high school, raised his eyebrows at her requests, but didn't ask questions. He simply led her to the appropriate filing cabinets and left her to her research. The original deed to the Roberts property dated back to 1875, when Edwin Roberts purchased 10 acres from the county for a surprisingly modest sum. There was nothing obviously suspicious about the transaction, though Eleanor noted that her grandfather had paid significantly less than the market value at the time. The land had previously been listed as county property, designated as uninhabited wilderness. Eleanor frowned. That classification seemed odd for land so close to town. She requested maps from before 1875 and spent hours comparing them to more recent surveys. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The land where the Roberts house stood had not always been uninhabited wilderness. An 1867 map showed a small settlement in that exact location, labeled simply as Indian Camp. By the 1875 map, it had disappeared entirely, with no explanation of what had happened to it or its inhabitants. "Mr. Morris," Eleanor called to the clerk, "do you have any records relating to the native settlements in this area before 1870? Morris scratched his head. "Not much official documentation on that, I'm afraid, but old Mrs. Pearson at the Historical Society might know something. Her father was one of the first coal prospectors in the region." The Historical Society was housed in a small building on Main Street, its walls lined with photographs of stern-faced pioneers and glass cases displaying arrowheads and mining tools. Mrs. Pearson, a tiny woman with a stooped back and alert eyes, listened to Eleanor's inquiries with obvious interest. "The Roberts property?" "Yes. There was a small encampment of Shawnee there until about 1868, she confirmed. Not many, perhaps 20 people who had refused to move west with the main tribe decades earlier. They lived quietly, kept to themselves. What happened to them?" Eleanor asked, though she already feared the answer. Mrs. Pearson's expression grew somber. There was coal discovered in the hills, you see, valuable deposits. The mining company wanted all the land in the area. The official record says the remaining natives agreed to relocate, but... She lowered her voice. My father told a different story. He said there was a conflict. The mining company hired men to drive them out. It turned violent. There was a massacre, Eleanor said flatly. Mrs. Pearson nodded reluctantly. Not officially recorded, of course. The company hushed it up. Afterward, they found they couldn't mine that particular plot after all. Something about the soil composition. So they sold it cheap to your grandfather, who worked as a legal advisor for the mining company. A favor for services rendered, my father always said. Eleanor felt sick. My grandfather knew what had happened there. Oh, more than knew, dear. According to my father, Edwin Roberts was the one who organized the removal. He drew up the falsified agreements, hired the men who carried it out, and then ensured the whole affair was buried, figuratively and literally. Eleanor left the Historical Society with her mind reeling. The respectable family legacy she'd been raised to revere had been built on a foundation of blood and deception. The shadow in the photograph suddenly made terrible sense. Back at the house, Eleanor went straight to the cellar, a dank space she had always avoided. The dirt floor was hard-packed, but she knew what she was looking for now. In the northeast corner, where the ground seemed slightly raised, she began to dig with a gardening trowel. She didn't have to dig far. Just 18 inches down, the trowel struck something solid. Carefully brushing away the soil, Eleanor uncovered a human bone, a fragment of skull with a clear indentation that could only have been caused by a violent blow. Eleanor sat back on her heels, horrified yet vindicated in her suspicions. The shadow had a reason for haunting the Roberts family, a very good reason. That night, she didn't even attempt to sleep. Instead, she sat in the parlor with all the lights blazing, a Bible open on her lap, though she hadn't been to church in years. I know you're here, she said aloud to the empty room. I know what my grandfather did to your people. I know why you've been watching us. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, the flames in the fireplace dimming as if starved of oxygen. On the wall opposite Eleanor, a shadow began to form, the same human shape from the photographs, but now so distinct she could make out individual fingers on its hands, the outline of eyes in its face. "What do you want?" Eleanor whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "Revenge, justice." The shadow didn't respond, but it seemed to grow larger, spreading across the wall like spilled ink. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. My grandfather is dead. My father is dead. Will you take me too? Will that satisfy your need for vengeance? The shadow began to move, sliding across the wall toward her, its form elongating grotesquely. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself. But instead of the cold touch she expected, she felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of images flooding her mind. Flashes of faces she didn't recognize, sounds of screams and gunfire, the sensation of running in terror through woods, the crushing weight of soil being piled on top of her still-living body. When the visions subsided, Eleanor was on the floor, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. The shadow had retreated to the far wall, watching her. "You don't want revenge," she realized aloud. "You want to be found, acknowledged, properly buried." The shadow rippled slightly, as if in affirmation. Eleanor nodded shakily. "I understand now. I'll help you. But I need time." Over the next week, Eleanor took a leave of absence from her teaching position, claiming illness. She spent her days researching burial rites of the Shawnee people and consulting discreetly with an anthropologist from Ohio University in nearby Athens. She also made a significant withdrawal from her savings account and purchased a small plot of land on the edge of town, a peaceful meadow overlooking the creek. At night, the shadow continued to manifest in the house, growing increasingly distinct. Eleanor no longer feared it, though its presence still chilled her to the bone. Sometimes she would speak to it, explaining her plans, asking for patience. It never responded in words, but sometimes objects in the room would move slightly, a book falling open to a particular page, a map unfolding to highlight a specific location. 2 weeks after her discovery in the cellar, Eleanor hired laborers to excavate specific areas of the property, claiming she was planning to install a new septic system and garden. The men were puzzled by her precise instructions and insistence on careful digging, but the substantial pay she offered discouraged questions. By the 3rd day, they had uncovered the remains of 17 individuals, men, women, and children, all bearing signs of violent death. Eleanor insisted the workers handle the bones with respect, personally overseeing their careful removal and temporary storage in specially prepared cedar boxes. Word of the grim discovery spread through town like wildfire. The sheriff came to investigate, along with a representative from the state government. Eleanor presented them with her research, including the historical maps and the testimony of Mrs. Pearson. She omitted any mention of the shadow, knowing it would only undermine her credibility. After much deliberation and consultation with Shawnee tribal representatives who traveled from Oklahoma, it was agreed that the remains would be reburied in the meadow Eleanor had purchased, with appropriate ceremonies conducted by tribal elders. The day of the reburial was overcast but warm, the threat of rain holding off as if by agreement. Nearly half the town attended, standing respectfully aside as the Shawnee elders conducted their rituals. Eleanor stood apart from the other locals, acutely aware of her family's responsibility for the tragedy being commemorated. As the final prayers were spoken and the ground closed over the reburied remains, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She glanced at her own shadow, cast normally on the ground by the emerging sun, and saw nothing unusual. That night, for the first time in weeks, Eleanor slept peacefully in the Roberts house. No shadows moved on the walls, no cold spots chilled the air. In the morning, she began packing her father's belongings, finally ready to move forward. It was while sorting through his closet that she found it, a small wooden box pushed far back on the highest shelf. Inside was a leather-bound journal with Edwin Roberts' name embossed on the cover. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. The journal detailed not just the massacre of the Shawnee encampment, but a subsequent tragedy that had never made it into any official record. According to Edwin's entries, there had been a survivor, a young woman who had been away from the camp during the attack. Upon returning to find her family and community murdered, she had confronted Edwin directly, cursing him and his descendants. She claimed her spirit would never leave this place until justice was done, Edwin wrote. I dismissed her ravings as grief and superstition. 3 days later, she was found hanged from a tree on the property line. The authorities ruled it suicide in their report, but I know better. Bradford and Thompson took matters into their own hands, despite my explicit instructions to leave her be. Now her blood is on my hands as well. Edwin's final entry on the matter was chilling. I ordered Bradford and Thompson to bury her secretly, away from her people. They tell me it is done, but they were drunk and vague about the location. I fear this will come back to haunt us all. Eleanor closed the journal, understanding at last. 17 bodies recovered and reburied. But according to the historical records and the Shawnee elders, there should have been 18 members of the band. One was still missing, and one shadow still lingered. Eleanor spent the remainder of the summer searching for the 18th victim. She expanded her excavation to the property boundaries, focusing on areas where the ground seemed disturbed or vegetation grew differently. She consulted old maps, trying to identify where 2 drunk men might have hastily buried a body in 1868. She even tried communicating directly with the shadow, asking it to guide her. But as August faded into September and the new school year began, Eleanor had found nothing. She returned to teaching, though she continued her search on evenings and weekends. The shadow, which had briefly disappeared after the reburial ceremony, returned to the house, fainter than before, but undeniably present. I'm trying, Eleanor would tell it on particularly frustrating nights. "I haven't given up." In late September, James telephoned with unexpected news. "I'm coming for a visit," he announced without preamble, "with Judith and the children." Eleanor was taken aback. Her brother hadn't set foot in the Roberts house since their father's funeral, and he had never brought his wife and children to Millfield at all. "Why now?" she asked. There was a pause on the line. "Judith thinks it's time the children saw where their father grew up," James said, but his tone suggested there was more to it. "We'll arrive Saturday morning, just for the weekend." After hanging up, Eleanor surveyed the house with new eyes. The shadow had been dormant lately, manifesting only occasionally and never when she had visitors. But a prolonged visit from family members, direct descendants of Edwin Roberts, might provoke it. She spent the next few days cleaning vigorously, not just to prepare for guests, but to keep her anxiety at bay. She made up beds in the 3 spare bedrooms, aired out linens that hadn't been used in years, and stocked the pantry with food for James's family. They arrived mid-morning on Saturday, James looking tense and older than his 32 years, his wife Judith politely curious, and their 3 children wide-eyed at the size and age of the house. 10-year-old Henry, named after his grandfather, immediately wanted to explore the attic. 8-year-old Mary asked about ghosts with the directness only children can muster. 4-year-old Thomas clung to his mother's hand, clearly intimidated by the unfamiliar surroundings. "What a characterful home," Judith commented as Eleanor showed them to their rooms. "It's been in your family for generations," James mentioned. "Since 1876, Eleanor confirmed, "built by our grandfather, Edwin. And you live here all alone?" Judith's tone was casual, but Eleanor detected a note of concern. "I prefer my own company," Eleanor said simply. The day passed pleasantly enough. They walked into town for lunch at the small diner, where the children attracted smiles and comment from locals unused to seeing new faces. James pointed out landmarks from his childhood, the school they had both attended, the park where he had played baseball, the creek where they had caught frogs in summer. Eleanor watched her brother gradually relaxing, becoming more animated as he shared memories with his children. It was a side of James she rarely saw, and it softened something in her toward him. That evening, after a dinner of pot roast and apple pie, James suggested taking a family photograph on the front porch. "We should document this visit," he said, setting up the camera he had brought. "The first time all the Roberts descendants have been together in years." Eleanor froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Perhaps it's too dark now," she suggested. "The light would be better in the morning." "Nonsense," James countered. "The porch light is plenty bright. Come on, Eleanor, for the family album." Reluctantly, Eleanor joined the family on the porch. James set the timer on his camera and hurried to position himself beside Judith, who held Thomas on her lap. Eleanor stood slightly apart, smiling stiffly as the shutter clicked. Later, after the children were in bed, James developed the photograph in the bathroom he had temporarily converted into a dark room. Eleanor waited in the hallway, heart pounding. When James emerged, his face was ashen. "Look at this," he whispered, holding out the still damp photograph. "Tell me you see it too." In the image, the Roberts family was clearly visible on the porch, illuminated by the porch light. And behind them, stretching across the white clapboard siding of the house, was a human-shaped shadow, more distinct than it had ever been in previous photographs. It stood directly behind young Henry, its outline so clear that it almost appeared three-dimensional. "What is that?" James hissed, careful not to wake his family. "Is this house haunted? Have you seen this before?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "We need to talk, James. There's something you should know about our family." They sat in the kitchen, where Eleanor explained everything. The massacre that had founded their family fortune, the discovery of the remains, the reburial ceremony, and the one victim still missing. She showed him Edwin's journal and the family photographs documenting the shadow's progression over decades. James listened in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief, but never interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This is why I left," he finally said. "I always felt something in this house, a presence, a weight. I thought it was just my imagination or the pressure of living up to Father's expectations." He looked at Eleanor with new respect. "But you stayed, you faced it, you've tried to make it right." "Not successfully," Eleanor pointed out. "The 18th victim is still missing. Her spirit is still here." James was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You said the men who buried her were drunk." "They wouldn't have gone far, especially if they were trying to hide what they'd done from our grandfather." "I've searched the entire property," Eleanor reminded him. "The entire property as it exists now," James corrected. "But the original Roberts land was larger, wasn't it? Father sold the eastern parcel to the Wilsons in the 30s. Eleanor sat up straighter. "You're right. And there's a small creek running through that section. It would have been an easy landmark for two drunk men to remember." "We should look there," James said decisively. "First thing tomorrow." "The Wilsons built their house there 30 years ago," Eleanor pointed out. "We can hardly start digging up their yard." "We don't need to," James replied. "I have a friend who works with ground-penetrating radar for archaeological surveys. I can telephone him in Cincinnati tomorrow. If there's a burial site there, his equipment can locate it without disturbing the surface." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "James, that's brilliant," he smiled ruefully. "I may have run from this house, but I never stopped thinking about it. Or about you, Eleanor. I've always admired your strength." The moment of connection between siblings was broken by a child's frightened cry from upstairs. They both rushed to the second floor to find young Henry sitting up in bed, trembling. "There was a lady in my room," he sobbed as his mother tried to comfort him. "She was standing in the corner watching me, but she wasn't really there. I could see through her." Eleanor and James exchanged alarmed glances. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart," Judith soothed, though she looked questioningly at her husband. "Perhaps we should all sleep downstairs tonight," James suggested. "In the parlor, like a camping adventure." The children, even frightened Henry, were excited by this unexpected treat. Eleanor and Judith arranged blankets and pillows on the floor while James built up the fire. Soon the three children were asleep again, with Judith dozing beside them. "The shadow is getting stronger," Eleanor whispered to James as they kept watch from armchairs on opposite sides of the room. "It's never appeared to anyone but me before, and never so visibly." "It knows we're all here," James said grimly. "The complete Roberts lineage, under one roof. If it wants justice from our family, this is its chance." Eleanor shivered. "We need to find her remains. Quickly." The night passed without further incident, though neither Eleanor nor James slept much. In the morning, James placed a long-distance call to his friend in Cincinnati, explaining the situation in carefully vague terms. To Eleanor's relief, the friend agreed to drive to Millfield that very day with his equipment. While they waited, the family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They ate breakfast, played board games with the children, and avoided discussing what had happened during the night. But there was a tension in the air, a watchfulness. Even little Thomas seemed to sense it, staying unusually close to his parents. Dr. Russell Whitman arrived just after lunch, a jovial, bearded man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He brought with him what looked like a modified lawnmower with various dials and attachments. "Ground-penetrating radar," he explained to the fascinated children. "It lets me see what's buried under the ground without digging it up, like X-ray vision, but for dirt." "Are you looking for treasure?" Mary asked excitedly. Dr. Whitman glanced at James, who gave a slight shake of his head. "Just helping your father and aunt with some research," he replied diplomatically. The Wilsons, fortunately, were away for the weekend, allowing Dr. Whitman to survey their property without awkward explanations. The children watched from the property line as he methodically pushed his equipment back and forth across the Wilsons' expansive backyard. occasionally stopping to make notes or adjust settings. It was near the creek, just as James had predicted, that the equipment registered something significant. Dr. Whitman called James over, pointing to a readout on his machine. "There's definitely something buried here," he confirmed. "About 4 feet down, roughly the size and shape of a human body. It's been there a long time. The soil composition around it is uniform, suggesting no recent disturbance." James thanked his friend profusely, and after extracting a promise of confidentiality, saw him off with a generous payment for his time and discretion. "Now what?" James asked Eleanor once they were alone, the children having gone with Judith to pick late blackberries from bushes along the fence line. "Now we need permission to excavate," Eleanor said, "and we need to do this properly with respect." That evening, Eleanor telephoned both the sheriff and Mrs. Holloway, explaining the situation. Plans were quickly arranged. The Wilsons, when contacted at their daughter's home in Columbus, were understandably startled but ultimately sympathetic when told a simplified version of the history. They gave permission for a limited excavation under the sheriff's supervision. The following morning, Sunday, the day James and his family had originally planned to return to Cincinnati, dawned clear and cool. The children were told they were spending one more day in Millfield because of important family business, which they accepted with minimal complaint when promised ice cream afterward. While Judith took the children to church and then to the small-town park, Eleanor, James, the sheriff, and 2 deputies went to the Wilson property. Mrs. Holloway accompanied them, along with a Shawnee representative, who had remained in the area after the earlier reburial ceremony, anticipating this very development. The excavation was conducted with care and reverence. Just as Dr. Whitman's equipment had indicated, they found human remains approximately 4 feet below the surface, near the creek bank. Unlike the victims found on the Roberts property, these bones showed signs of having been buried individually and with some minimal care, wrapped in what had once been a blanket, now deteriorated to mere fragments of fabric. "This is her," Mrs. Holloway said quietly as the bones were carefully exposed. "The last one, the one who cursed your family." The Shawnee representative, a solemn woman named Sarah Blackfeather, nodded in agreement. "Her spirit has been waiting a long time." The remains were carefully transferred to a cedar box, similar to those used for the previous reburials. Plans were made to inter her with her people the following day, with proper ceremonies. That evening, the shadow appeared one final time in the Roberts house. It manifested in the parlor, where the entire family was gathered, forming on the wall so clearly that even Judith gasped and pulled Thomas protectively closer. "What is that?" Mary whispered, wide-eyed but more curious than frightened. "A visitor," Eleanor said simply. "Someone who has been waiting a very long time to rest." The shadow seemed to consider them all, its outline rippling slightly as if in a breeze. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, it moved. Not toward any of the adults, but toward young Henry. The boy stood perfectly still, watching with solemn eyes as the shadow enveloped him briefly in what almost appeared to be an embrace. Then it was gone, dissolving like mist in sunlight. Henry blinked and looked around at his stunned family. "She said thank you," he reported matter-of-factly, "and goodbye." The final burial took place Monday morning. James delayed his family's return to Cincinnati so they could attend. The ceremony was brief but dignified, with Sarah Blackfeather offering prayers in both English and Shawnee. Eleanor and James stood side by side as the last victim of their grandfather's crime was finally laid to rest with her people. "What happens now?" James asked quietly as they walked back to the house afterward. Eleanor considered the question. The shadow was gone. She felt its absence like a weight lifted from the house. For the first time since she could remember, the Roberts home felt simply like a house, not a repository of secrets and guilt. "Now we live with the truth," she answered. "We remember it, and we teach it to the next generation." She glanced meaningfully at Henry, Mary, and Thomas, who were running ahead on the path. So nothing like this happens again. James nodded thoughtfully. I was going to suggest you sell the house and move to Cincinnati, near us. But perhaps there's value in staying, in being the keeper of this history. There is, Eleanor agreed. Besides, it's my home. It always has been. That afternoon before they left, James insisted on taking one more family photograph on the front porch. They assembled in the same positions as before, James and Judith with the children grouped around them, Eleanor slightly to the side. Are you sure this is a good idea? Eleanor whispered as James set the timer. I am, he replied with quiet conviction. We need to know. The camera clicked, capturing the moment. While the children gathered their belongings for the journey home, James quickly developed the photograph in his makeshift darkroom. When he emerged, his face showed profound relief. Look, he said, handing the still damp image to Eleanor. She studied it carefully. The family appeared just as they had posed, but this time there was no shadow lurking behind them. The white clapboard siding of the house formed a clean, unmarked backdrop. For the first time in nearly 70 years, a Roberts family photograph showed only the living. It's really over, Eleanor murmured. James squeezed her shoulder gently. Thanks to you. After tearful goodbyes and promises to visit again soon, James and his family departed for Cincinnati. Eleanor stood on the porch watching until their car disappeared around the bend in the road, then turned to face the empty house. It felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the very air inside had been refreshed. She walked through the rooms slowly, reacquainting herself with a home that was finally just a home. In the parlor, she paused to look at the family photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. The shadow was still visible in the older images, a permanent record of the wrong that had been done and the justice that had finally been served. Eleanor decided to leave them there. The Roberts family history, the full history, deserved to be remembered. That evening, as twilight settled over Millfield, Eleanor sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching fireflies rise from the grass. For the first time in her adult life, she felt at peace in the family home. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and autumn's approach. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the ordinary sounds of a small-town evening. Distant laughter, a dog barking, the occasional automobile passing on the main road. "Thank you," she whispered to the gathering darkness, though she knew no one was there to hear. The next day, Eleanor returned to teaching. Her students noticed a change in her, a new warmth, a readiness to smile that hadn't been there before. When one particularly bold student asked if something good had happened over the weekend, Eleanor considered how to answer. "Yes," she said finally. An old family matter was resolved. Life in Millfield continued in its quiet way. The war in Europe and the Pacific raged on, but news came that fall that the tide was turning in favor of the Allies. Young men would eventually return to the town, though many never would. The coal mines continued to operate, though the industry was clearly in decline. The seasons changed, as they always had. Eleanor began inviting James and his family for regular visits. The children grew to love the old house, exploring its many rooms and creating their own memories within its walls. Young Henry, in particular, developed a close bond with his aunt, showing an interest in the family history that both pleased and concerned Eleanor. One evening during their Christmas visit, she found him in the parlor, studying the old photographs. "Why do some of these pictures have a shadow in them and others don't?" he asked with a child's directness. Eleanor sat beside him, considering how much to share with a 10-year-old boy. "Those photographs tell a story," she said carefully, "about something that happened a long time ago, something our family needed to make right." "The lady who said thank you?" Henry asked, demonstrating that children often understand more than adults give them credit for. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "She was waiting for us to do the right thing." Henry nodded solemnly. "Did great-grandpa Edwin do something bad?" Eleanor looked at her nephew's innocent face, so like her father's had been in old photographs. "He made a terrible mistake," she said finally. "And then, instead of trying to fix it, he hid it. That's why the shadow stayed with our family for so long, to remind us that hidden wrongs don't disappear. They wait to be made right." Henry thought about this for a moment. "But we fixed it," he said with certainty, "and now she's at peace." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, impressed by his understanding. "Now she's at peace." As the years passed, Eleanor became the unofficial historian of Millfield. She documented not just the Roberts family story, but the broader history of the area, including the original Shawnee inhabitants and the impact of the coal industry on the community. She collaborated with Sarah Blackfeather to create educational materials about the displaced native populations, which were eventually incorporated into the local school curriculum. The meadow where the Shawnee remains were reburied became a memorial site, tended jointly by the town and by Shawnee representatives. Every year, a ceremony of remembrance was held there, attended by an increasingly diverse group of participants. Eleanor never married, but she was far from alone. James's children became like her own, spending summers and holidays at the Roberts house. When they grew up, they brought their own children to visit, filling the old rooms with laughter and new memories. In 1967, at the age of 60, Eleanor finally retired from teaching. By then, the Roberts house had become something of a local landmark, not for its architecture or age, but for the reconciliation it represented. Visitors sometimes reported feeling a profound sense of peace there, especially in the garden Eleanor had planted along the eastern boundary, where wildflowers grew in abundance every spring. On the 25th anniversary of the reburial ceremony, a journalist from a Columbus newspaper came to interview Eleanor about Millfield's unique approach to acknowledging its complicated past. The resulting article, titled "The Shadow of History: How One Ohio Town Confronted Its Past," brought unexpected attention to the small community. "Do you ever regret discovering the truth?" the journalist asked toward the end of their conversation. "Might it have been easier to just sell the house and move away, leave the past buried?" Eleanor, her hair now completely white but her blue eyes still sharp, considered the question carefully. "Truth is rarely the easiest path," she acknowledged, "but it's the only one that leads to genuine peace. My family carried the weight of that shadow for generations because we refused to see what was right in front of us. The moment I chose to look directly at it, to acknowledge what it was trying to show us, was the moment healing became possible." She gestured to a framed photograph on her desk, the one taken that Sunday afternoon in 1942, showing the Roberts family with no shadow behind them. "Some might call what happened in this house a haunting," she continued, "but I've come to see it differently. That shadow wasn't a curse or a punishment. It was a reminder that justice doesn't expire with time, that wrongs don't fade just because we refuse to look at them. In its own way, it was a gift, a chance to make something right, even generations later." The journalist studied Eleanor with newfound respect, and the house itself. "Do you still feel anything unusual here?" Eleanor smiled. "Only peace," she said simply. "Only peace." In the autumn of 1972, Eleanor Roberts passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the same bedroom where she had been born 75 years earlier. She left the house to James's eldest son, Henry, who had grown up to become a civil rights attorney. In her will, she also established a scholarship fund for Shawnee students and a trust to maintain the memorial site in perpetuity. At her funeral, attended by nearly the entire town, Sarah Blackfeather, now an elderly woman herself, spoke movingly of Eleanor's courage in confronting her family's past and her dedication to healing historical wounds. "Some people believe that time eventually buries all sins," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small church. Eleanor Roberts understood that true healing only comes through acknowledgement, atonement, and remembrance. She taught us that shadows persist, not to frighten us, but to guide us toward the light of truth. As evening fell after the service, James stood alone on the porch of the Roberts house, now his son's house, looking out at the gathering dusk. Though he had lived in Cincinnati for decades, a part of him had always remained connected to this place, to the events that had transformed his family 30 years earlier. "She did it, Eleanor," he murmured to the quiet air. "The truth is remembered. The past is honored, the shadow is gone." Inside, his son and grandchildren were preparing for their first night in the family home, their inheritance not just of property, but of story and responsibility. The old photographs still stood on the mantelpiece, including those showing the mysterious shadow that had once haunted the Roberts family. But there would be no shadows in any photographs taken in that house again, only the honest images of people who had learned that peace comes not from burying the past, but from bringing it into the light. In the years that followed, the story of the Roberts house and its shadow became part of local folklore, told and retold in ways that sometimes obscured the historical facts. But in the town records, in the memorial site, and in the educational materials still used in Millfield schools, the true story remained, a testament to one woman's courage in confronting a painful legacy and transforming it into a foundation for healing. And in the meadow where 18 Shawnee individuals finally found rest, wildflowers continued to bloom each spring, a living memorial to the power of truth and the possibility of reconciliation, even across the seemingly unbridgeable divides of time, culture, and death itself. The shadow without a body had found its purpose, and in doing so, had finally found peace.